Okay. Oh, that took some time. Welcome to Weekly Marx, 13th of April, 2025. We're looking at Karl Marx, Capital, Volume 1, the 2024 Princeton edition, chapters 20 and 21. Uh, these are short chapters, not a lot of math, thank God. And they they are they represent relative to capital itself, and in terms of the attempt, I think to streamline the translation. For example, they exclude a chart that was put in, I think, some at some moment, not probably not by Marx, but I included it anyway. And I've included, of course, Ed George's notes for the chapters, noting also that the numbering is different. And then I also included the Harry Cleaver outlines. And then there's also this little note by Ed George about the kind of descriptions or simplification that occurs. Circulation of capital, this is Ed George, follows the following phases. First, a sum of money is transformed into means of production and labor power. This takes place in the sphere of circulation, i.e., in the market. Second, in the sphere of production, the means of production are converted into commodities whose value exceeds that of their constituent parts. Third, again, in the market, the commodities must be sold. Their value must be converted into money, money which can now re-begin the circuit. In what follows here, this is the description of Ed George's notes. What is not going to be dealt with is number one, in detail, how capital passes through the sphere of circulation, and number two, how surplus value is distributed throughout the capitalist class. These are items that will be dealt with respectively in volumes 2 and 3. Rather, the following assumptions and generalizations will be made. We shall assume that the capitalist sells unproblematically her commodities at their value, and we shall not concern ourselves with their reappearance on the market, or the forms in which capital manifests itself while in the market and the conditions of reproduction behind these forms. And number two, we shall consider the capitalist abstractly as, quote, the representative of all those who will share the booty with him. The motive for this approach is that an exact analysis of the process demands that we should, for a time, disregard the phenomena that conceal the workings of its inner mechanism. Note that that's a description for chapter 23, because as I've as the table in the 2024 volume 1 translation indicates, there's you need a table to sort of see the differences, and so 20 is 22 in the more recent English translations, like the Penguin edition. And so we're looking at 20 and 21. It's the moment we get to part 7. We're going to be done with this I would assert, in a couple of weeks. So uh, good for that. uh, Whereas on Saturdays, where we're looking at theories of surplus value, we've only scratched the surface. So we're looking at today variations in wages from nation to nation and simple reproduction, chapter 21, which are, you can see in the table, the equivalent is chapter 22, national difference in wages, in the last English version, and chapter 23, simple reproduction. And next week we will carry on with transformation of surplus value into capital. So, chapter 20, variations in wages from nation to nation. In chapter 15, we considered the diverse combinations that a change in the absolute or relative magnitude of labor power's value can call forth, with relative magnitude referring to its magnitude as compared with that of surplus value. We also saw, however, that the amount of the means of subsistence in which labor power's price is realized can move independently are out of step with changes in that price, growing or shrinking. As we noted earlier, the simple translation of the value or price of labor power into the exoteric form of wages turns all of these laws into laws of the movement of wages. What appears within this movement as varying combinations can simultaneously present itself to different nations as wages varying along national lines. When we compare the wages of different nations, we therefore need to consider all the factors that determine whether and how much labor power's value changes, namely the price and extent of both basic natural wants and needs and the basic wants and needs shaped by history, the cost of training workers, the role of women and children in the labor force, labor's productivity, and its extensive and intensive magnitude. Even the most superficial comparison requires that the average daily wage for a given trade in different countries be reduced to workdays of uniform length. Once daily wages have been reduced to the same terms, the time wage has to be translated again into the piece wage, since only the latter can serve as a measure of both labor's productivity and its intensity. We will then find more often than not that one nation's lower daily wage expresses a higher price of labor, and another nation's higher daily wage expresses a lower price of labor. The possibility of just that combination having been revealed by the movement of daily wages itself. Compared with its less intense counterpart of the same length, a more intense National Workday is treated on the world market as having more hours, as being more extensive, that is, and furthermore, compared with its less productive counterpart, a more productive National Workday counts as a more intense one, as long as competition has enforced the more productive nation to lower the prices of its commodities to their value. Generally speaking, then, a more intense or productive National Workday is represented on the world market in greater money expression than a less intense or productive National Workday is. What holds for the workday holds also for each of its fractional segments. Labor's absolute price in money can thus be higher in one nation than another, even though with respect to relative wages the situation is reversed. Here, relative wages means wages relative to the surplus value workers produce, or the total value they produce, or the price of their means of subsistence. In his essay on the rate of wages, one of his earliest economic writings, Henry Carey attempted to show that the differences among national wages are directly proportional to the differences among national levels of productivity, his aim here being to deduce from this international ratio that wages everywhere rise and fall as labor's productive power does. Even if Carey had supported his premises instead of employing his standard practice, which was to treat statistical material uncritically and superficially, piling it into a jumbled heap, this conclusion would be absurd. As can be seen by from every part of our analysis of how surplus value is produced. Best of all, Carey doesn't argue that things are as they should be according to his own theory. State intervention has distorted a natural economic relation. And natural wages must therefore be calculated as though the workers themselves receive the part that goes to the state in the form of taxes. Shouldn't Mr. Carey think again about whether these state expenses are natural fruits resulting from the development of the capitalist system? His logic is befitting of a man who declared capitalist relations of production to be eternal laws of nature and reason, laws whose harmonious free play could only be disturbed by state intervention, but then discovered that state intervention, i.e., the protection of these laws by the state or the system of protectionism, was made into a necessity by England's diabolical influence on the world market, which England apparently didn't owe to the natural laws of capitalist production. Carey also discovered that the theories by Ricardo and others that formulate existing social antagonisms and contradictions should hardly be seen as the ideal product of real economic development. Rather, the reverse is true. The real antagonisms of capitalist production in England and elsewhere resulted from those theories. Lastly, Carey discovered that in the end, trade destroys the inborn beauty and harmony of the capitalist mode of production. If he had gone just a step further, he might have realized that the only thing wrong with capitalist production is capital itself. Never mind Carey's protectionist heresies. Only such a man, one of such frightful ingenuousness and erudition, de foi alloy, deserve to become the secret source that supplied the likes of Bastiat and others free trade optimists with their harmonious wisdom. That's the end of chapter 20. Needless to say, short. These are the endnotes. It's not accurate to say that wages at issue here is their price are increased because they purchase more of a cheaper article. Note 1. Note 2, in polemicizing against Adam Smith, James Anderson says, it deserves likewise to be remarked that although the apparent price of labor is usually lower in poor countries where the produce of the soil and grain in general is cheap, yet it is, in fact, for the most part, really higher than in other countries. For it is not the wages that are given to the laborer per day that constitutes the real price of labor, although it is its apparent price. The real price is that which a certain quantity of work performed actually costs the employer. And considered in this light, labor is in almost all cases cheaper in rich countries than in those that are poor, although the price of grain and other provisions is usually much lower in the last than in the first. Labor estimated by the day is much lower in Scotland than in England. Labor by the piece is generally cheaper in England. Labor being dearer in Ireland than it is in England because the wages are so much lower. um, and note 3, Mr. Cowell, however, by a most elaborate analysis of cotton spinning, endeavors to prove that in his supplementary report that the wages in England are virtually lower to the capitalist, although higher to the operative, than on the continent of Europe. Number 4, it's just a note on the essay of the rate of wages with an explanation of the causes of the differences in the conditions of the laboring population throughout the world, printed in Philadelphia in 1835. In volume 4 of this work, I will give a more precise account of the superficiality of his scholarship. Oh, that volume 4. And this is the editor's note. De faux alloy is a French phrase meaning fake or spurious. I included here a section that is not included in the 2024 edition, which gives a graph that or a table that shows the a difference in international production of spindles per factory. And I assume the editors didn't think it was all that profound or necessary. And in a second now, I will I'm going to take a break right now in our stuff here, and we'll start up again in a second. We're going to do simple reproduction, chapter 21. Okie doke. We are back. The production process has to be continuous. Whatever social form it takes, it must periodically repeat the same phases anew. A society can stop producing no more than it could stop consuming. Thus, then, when viewed both as an integrated whole and as always being in the flux of renewal, every social production process is also a process of reproduction. The conditions required for production are at the same time those required for reproduction. No society can keep producing, that is, reproducing, unless it continuously reverse transforms some part of its products into means of production or the elements of fresh production. If all other circumstances stay as they are, a society can reproduce or maintain its wealth on the same scale only by replacing the means of production consumed during the year. the means of labor, raw materials, and auxiliary materials with an equal quantity of new articles that are taken out of the mass of products produced each year and reincorporated into the production process. In other words, a certain amount of the annual product has to go back into production. The products that constitute this part are made for the productive consumption and tend to exist in natural forms not suited for consumption by individuals. If the form of production is the capitalist one, then the form of reproduction will be too. Just as the labor process appears in the capitalist mode of production only as something that mediates the valorization process, so too the reproduction process appears only as a means to reproduce the value advanced as capital, i.e., value that valorizes itself. That's self-valorization. The economic actor's mask, capitalist, will stay on a person only if his money keeps functioning as capital. Suppose a sum of 100 pounds is advanced this year. If it is transformed into capital and produces 20 pounds of surplus value, it has to repeat the same operation next year, the year after that, and so on, periodically adding to capital's value, or as the regular fruit of capital in motion, surplus value takes on the form of revenue arising from capital. If this revenue serves the capitalist only as a fund for consumption, if it is spent as regularly as it is acquired, then, assuming all other conditions remain unchanged, simple reproduction takes place. Such simple reproduction merely repeats the production process on the same scale, but this mere repetition or continuation also gives the process new characteristics, or rather, it clears away characteristics the process appears to have when seen in isolation. The purchase of labor power for a certain amount of time initiates the production process. This initial moment recurs when the time is up and a production period of a certain length has come to an end, whether a week, a month, or longer. But the worker isn't paid until after his labor power has produced its effect, realizing in commodities both its own value and surplus value. The worker thus produces not only surplus value, which for now we are viewing only as the fund the capitalist uses for consumption, but also the fund used for his own payment, or the variable capital, before it flows back to him in the form of actual wages. In fact, the worker will be employed only for as long as he keeps reproducing that fund. Hence, the political economist's formula mentioned earlier in chapter 16 that represents salary as a share of the product itself. Now, what keeps flowing back to the worker in the form of wages is a part of the product that he constantly reproduces. While the capitalist pays the worker commodity value in money, this money is simply the transformed form of the labor product, or rather part of the labor product. As the worker turns part of the means of production into the product, part of a product he's already produced is turned back into money. The labor that the worker performs next week or next month will thus be paid for with the labor he performed the previous week or the previous month. The illusion brought about by the money form disappears the moment when we look at the whole capitalist class and the whole working class rather than the individual capitalist and the individual worker, because the capitalist class constantly gives the working class drafts in the form of money on a portion of the product produced by members of the latter class and appropriated by members of the former one. The worker gives these drafts back to members of the capitalist class just as constantly, thereby obtaining from the capitalist his allotted share of his own product. This transaction is disguised by the product's commodity form and the commodity's money form. Variable capital is thus nothing but a particular historical form of appearance of the fund for the means of subsistence, or the labor fund that the worker needs in order to maintain and reproduce himself, and that he has to keep producing and reproducing in every system of social production. The labor fund constantly flows to the worker in the form of the means of payment for his labor only because his own product constantly moves away from him in the form of capital. But the labor fund's form of appearance here does nothing to alter the circumstance that the capitalist advances the worker the latter's own objectified labor. Take a peasant who has to perform compulsory labor. Let's say he works with his own means of production in his own fields 3 days a week. He spends the other 3 workdays doing compulsory labor on the lord's estate. The peasant constantly reproduces his own labor fund, which under these terms won't take on the form of a means payment for his labor, that is advanced by another person. Accordingly, his unpaid forced labor won't take on the form of voluntary and paid labor. If the estate owner began one day to appropriate the peasant's fields, cattle, and seed for himself, or in short, the peasant's means of production, the peasant would have to start selling his labor power to the estate owner. Assuming all other conditions remain the same, the peasant would work 6 days a week just as before, and he would still spend 3 days performing labor for himself and the other 3 days working for the estate owner, who has now been transformed into a wage-paying capitalist. The peasant would continue to use up the means of production as the means of production, transferring their value to the product. As before, a certain amount of the product would be put toward reproduction. But just as forced labor would take on the form of wage labor, so the labor fund, and here too, the worker would have to produce and reproduce it himself, would take on the form of capital the worker is advanced by his former master. The bourgeois economist, whose unimposing brain can't distinguish between a form of appearance and the thing appearing through that form, averts his eyes from the fact that even today, when the labor fund enters the scene somewhere in the world, it really does so in the form of capital. Of course, variable capital stops playing the part of value advanced from the capitalist's own fund only when we view the capitalist production process in the context of the constant flux of its renewal. But that production process had to begin sometime, somewhere, and so from our present standpoint, it seems likely that at some moment the capitalist became a money owner as the result of an instance of original accumulation not tied to the unpaid labor of others. This, it seems, is what enabled him to appear in the market as a buyer of labor power. At the same time, the mere continuity of the capitalist production process, i.e., simple reproduction, brings about other extraordinary changes that decisively affect both the variable part of capital and the total capital. Suppose the surplus value produced annually with 1,000 pounds of capital amounts to 200 pounds, and this 200 pounds is also consumed annually. If the same process is repeated every year for 5 years, the sum of the surplus value consumed will be 5 times 200, an amount equal to the 1,000 pounds of the original capital. Now, suppose the annual surplus value is only partially consumed. Let's say half of it is. If the production process were repeated every year for 10 years, the result would be the same as before, since 10 times 100 equals 1,000. As a general rule, when we divide the value of the capital advanced by the surplus value consumed annually, we get the number of years, or the number of reproduction periods, over which the capitalist consumes the capital originally advanced, and thus, at the end of which, the original capital disappears. The capitalist thinks he consumes the product of somebody else's unpaid labor, or the surplus value, and retains the original value spent as capital. But his wrong-headed idea does nothing to change the facts here. After a certain number of years have passed, the capital value he possesses will be equal to the sum of the surplus value he has appropriated without an equivalent during the same period, and the total value he has consumed will be equal to the original capital value. Not even an atom of his old capital still exists. So, the mere continuity of the labor process, i.e., simple reproduction, necessarily transforms every mass of capital into accumulated capital, or capitalized surplus value. Whether this process takes more or less time and irrespective of all accumulation, even where capital starts out as property, its owner earned with his own labor, sooner or later, and whether or not it takes the form of money, it becomes value that is appropriated without an equivalent. In other words, the materialization of someone else's unpaid labor. The production and circulation of commodities isn't the only precondition that had to be in place before money could be transformed into capital. A money or value owner and the owner of value-creating substance, i.e., a person who has acquired some means of production and subsistence, and someone who owns labor power, had to encounter each other in the commodity market as a buyer and as a seller. The separation of the labor product and labor itself, of the objective factors needed for the labor process and human labor power, was thus the pre-existing foundation of the capitalist process of production. the sheer continuity of that process. In other words, simple reproduction reproduces and perpetuates the starting point of the process, making it into its characteristic result. The production process continuously transforms money into capital and the means of production into means of valorization. On the other hand, the worker keeps emerging from the process as he was upon entering it. Even before he begins to work, his own labor has already been alienated from him, appropriated by the capitalist, and incorporated into capital. Thus, his labor is constantly objectified during the production process in a product that belongs to someone else. And since this process is simultaneously the process in which the capitalist consumes labor power, the worker's product is continuously transformed not only to not only commodities but also capital, that is, value that drinks value creating power, means of subsistence that in fact buy people, and means of production that in fact employ producers. It is the worker himself, then, who constantly produces objective wealth as capital, an alien power that exploits and rules over him, while the capitalist just as constantly produces labor power as a subjective abstract source of wealth that has been separated from its own means of objectification and realization and exists only in the worker's body. In short, the capitalist just as constantly keeps producing the worker as a wage laborer. This constant reproduction or perpetuation of the worker is the sine qua non of capitalist production. As we know, the transaction that takes place between the capitalist and the worker is as follows. The capitalist exchanges one part of his capital, the variable part, for labor power, namely the living power to valorize that he incorporates into his dead means of production. In this way, the labor process also becomes the capitalist process of valorization. The worker, for his part, uses the money he gets for his labor power to buy the means of subsistence with which he maintains and reproduces himself. This is the worker's individual consumption, but the labor process, where he consumes the means of production by transforming them into products, represents the worker's productive consumption and also the consumption of his labor power by the capitalist. The worker's individual and productive consumption differ fundamentally. In the one case, as labor power, he belongs to capital. Here he is incorporated into the production process. In the other case, the worker belongs to himself and carries out individual life actions that take place outside the process of production. Let me break here for a second. When we examined the workday, we saw now and again that the worker tends to be forced to make his individual consumption into a mere moment in the production process. He takes in his means of subsistence so that his labor power can stay activated, just as a steam engine is fed coal and water or a gear gets oil. His means of consumption have become nothing but the means of consumption of a means of production. His individual consumption is directly productive consumption. This is seen, however, as an abuse of labor that really is an essential to capitalist production. Now, but what happens when we turn away from a commodity's isolated production process and instead consider the interconnected movement of the capitalist production process on its full social scale? The worker's individual consumption remains an aspect of the production and reproduction of capital, whether his consuming occurs inside or outside the workshop or factory, or inside or outside the labor process. Just as the cleaning of a machine remains an aspect of capital's production and reproduction, whether it occurs during the labor process itself or during a pause, it makes no difference here that a worker consumes for himself and not the capitalist. The fact that beasts of burden enjoy what they eat doesn't mean their eating is any less necessary for the production process. The continuous maintenance and reproduction of the working class is a permanent condition of capital's reproduction, which workers are motivated to satisfy by their own drive to live and reproduce. The capitalist can count on that. He merely sees to it that the worker's individual consumption is limited to the bare necessities. In this, the capitalist is worlds away from the primitive South American practice of forcing workers to eat hearty foods rather than light ones. When one part of capital becomes labor power, the capitalist kills two birds with one stone. He transforms part of his capital into variable capital, thereby valorizing his total capital. He incorporates labor power into his means of production, or in other words, consumes labor power productively by having the worker productively consume the means of production with his labor. At the same time, the means of subsistence, which represent the part of capital that goes to the worker, are transformed into the worker's muscles, nerves, bone, brain, and so on. When members of the working class carry out absolutely necessary acts of individual consumption, the means of subsistence that capital disposes of in exchange for labor power are reverse transformed into newly exploitable labor power. Within its necessary limits, such consumption is the production and reproduction of capital's most essential means of production, the workers themselves. It therefore constitutes an aspect of capital's overall process of reproduction. Here, the capitalist and his theoretician, the political economist, treat only one part of the worker's individual consumption as productive, the part whereby members of the working class consume what they need in order to perpetuate themselves, which has to happen for capital to be able to consume labor power. Whatever the worker consumes for other purposes, such as pleasure, is non-productive consumption. If the accumulation of capital were to cause wages and thus the worker's means of consumption to increase, but with capital consuming the same amount of labor power as before, the additional capital would be consumed non-productively. The worker's individual consumption is in fact non-productive from his own standpoint because it merely reproduces a needy and desiring individual. His individual consumption is productive for the capitalist and the state, however, because it produces the power that produces wealth for other people. So from society's standpoint, the members of the working class, including when they aren't participating in the immediate labor process, belong to capital just as much as the dead instruments of labor do. Even their individual consumption is simply an aspect of capital's reproduction process, at least within certain limits. This process makes it hard for the worker, that instrument of production endowed with consciousness, to simply run away, since it constantly sends his product from his pole to the opposite pole, i.e. capital's. Individual consumption is the means through which workers maintain and reproduce themselves, but as it occurs, it constantly destroys their means of subsistence, ensuring that they will keep reappearing in the labor market. The Roman slave was fettered with chains. Invisible ties bind the wage laborer to his owner. He merely seems to be independent. The constant turnover among the workers' individual wage masters and the fictio juris of his contract keep this semblance in place. In the past, capital enacted compulsory laws whenever it felt it had to assert its proprietary rights over free workers. Until 1815, for example, it was illegal for England's machine workers to emigrate, and people committed this crime at their peril, since the penalties it carried were severe. Reproducing the working class also implies the accumulation of skills and their transmission from one generation to the next. The capitalist treats the existence of such a skilled working class as one of the conditions of production that belong to him, viewing it in fact as the real existence of his variable capital. How far he goes in this is revealed the moment a crisis threatens to take that class away. The American Civil War and the accompanying cotton famine put the majority of cotton workers in Lancashire out of work, as is well known. From deep within members of the working class and other social strata, too, there came a cry for state support or voluntary national subscriptions that would allow the workers made superfluous to emigrate to English colonies or the United States. Edmund Potter, a former president of the Manchester Chamber of Commerce, responded with an open letter in the Times. Published on March 24th, 1863, it was rightly described in the House of Commons as, quote, the manifesto of the manufacturers, unquote. Below, readers will find a few characteristic passages where capital's proprietary rights over labor power are frankly asserted. Quote, the idle man may be told the supply of cotton workers is too large. It must follow the natural rules of supply and demand, and in fact, be reduced by a third, perhaps, and then there will be a healthy demand for the remaining two-thirds. Public opinion urges emigration. The master cotton manufacturer cannot willingly see his labor supply being removed. He may think, and may perhaps justly, that it is both wrong and unsound. But if the public funds are to be devoted to assist emigration, he has a right to be heard and perhaps to protest, unquote. This same Potter goes on to discuss how useful the cotton industry is, how, quote, it has undoubtedly drawn the surplus population from Ireland and from many agricultural districts, unquote. Uh, how enormous it is, how it accounted for 5/13 of all English exports in 1860, how in a few years it will expand again by enlarging the market, especially in India, and by coercing a sufficient, quote, supply of cotton at six shillings per pound. He then says, quote, it is not denied that time, 1, 2, or 3 years it may be, will produce the quantity. The question I would put then is this: is the trade worth retaining? Is it worthwhile to keep the machinery, he means the living labor machines, in order? And is it not the greatest folly to think of parting with that? I think it is. I allow that the workers are not a property, not the property of Lancashire or the masters, but they are the strength of both. They are the mental and trained power which cannot be replaced for a generation. The mere machinery which they work might much of it be beneficially replaced, nay, improved in a 12-month. Encourage or allow the working power to emigrate, and what of the capitalists? This cri de coeur reminds one of Lord Chamberlain Call. Quote, take away the cream of the workers, the fixed capital will depreciate in a great degree, and the floating will not subject itself to a struggle with a short supply of inferior labor. We are told the workers wish it, that is, emigration. Very natural it is that they should do so. Compress the cotton trade by taking away its working power and reducing their wages expenditure, say 1/3 or 5 millions. And what then would happen to the class above, the small shopkeepers? And what of the rents, the cottage rents? Trace such effects upward to the small farmer, the better householder, and the landowner. And say, if there could be any suggestion more suicidal to all classes of the country than by enfeebling a nation by exporting the best of its manufacturing population and destroying the value of some of its most productive capital and enrichment, unquote. Quote, I suggest, then, a loan of 5 or 6 millions sterling, pounds sterling, extending, it may be, over 2 or 3 years, administered by special commissioners added to the boards of guardians in the cotton districts under special legislative regulations enforcing some occupation or labor as a means of keeping up at least the moral standard of the recipients of the loan. But can anything be worse for landowners or masters than parting with the best of the workers and demoralizing and disappointing the rest by an extended depletive emigration, a depletion of capital and value in an entire province? Potter, the cotton manufacturer's chosen mouthpiece, distinguishes between two types of machinery. Both belong to the capitalist, but one is always housed in his factory, while the other spends its nights and Sundays in cottages. One kind is dead, the other is alive. Not only does the dead machinery wear down and lose value each day, but at any given moment, much of it is being rendered out of date by technological progress, which occurs constantly. In fact, the most efficient course of action is often to bring in new machines just after a few months. The living machinery, conversely, improves with experience, and as it accumulates the skills passed down from generation to generation. The Times replied to the factory magnate by saying, among other things, quote, Mr. Edmund Potter is so impressed with the exceptional and supreme importance of the cotton masters that in order to preserve this class and perpetuate their profession, he would keep 500,000 of the laboring class confined in a great moral workhouse against their will. Is the trade worth retaining? Asks Mr. Potter. Certainly, by all honest means, it is, we answer. It is worthwhile keeping the machinery in order. Again, asks Mr. Potter. Here we hesitate. By the machinery, Mr. Potter means the human machinery, for he goes to protest that he does not mean to use them as an absolute property. We must confess that we do not think it worthwhile or even possible to keep the human machinery in order, that is, to shut it up and keep it oiled until it is wanted. Human machinery will rust under inaction, oil, and rub it as you may. Moreover, the human machinery will, as we have just seen, get the steam up of its own accord and burst or run amok in our great towns. It might, as Mr. Potter says, require some time to reproduce the workers, but having machinists and capitalists at hand, We could always find thrifty, hard, industrious men wherewith to improvise more master manufacturers than we can ever want. Mr. Potter talks of the trade reviving in 1 or 2, 3 years, and he asks us not to encourage or allow the working power to emigrate. He says that it is even very natural that the workers should wish to emigrate, but he thinks that in spite of their desire, the nation ought to keep up this 500,000 of workers with their 700,000 dependents shut up in the cotton districts, and as a necessary consequence, he must of course think that the nation ought to keep down their discontent by force and sustain them by alms, and this upon the chance that the cotton masters may some day want them. This time is come when the great public opinion of these islands must operate to save the working power from those who would deal with it as they would deal with iron and coal and cotton. The article in the Times was only a jeu d'esprit. The great public opinion was Potter's view that factory workers were mobile accessories of the factory. Workers were prevented from emigrating and locked up in the moral workhouse of the factory districts, where they represented, quote, the strength of the cotton masters of Lancashire, just as they had before. When the capitalist production process takes its course, it reproduces the separation between labor power and the things the worker needs to perform his labor. In doing so, it reproduces and perpetuates the conditions of the worker's exploitation. It keeps forcing the worker to sell his labor power in order to live, and it keeps enabling the capitalist to buy labor power as a way of acquiring wealth. No longer is it a matter of chance when a capitalist and worker encounter each other in the commodity market as a buyer and seller. The production process itself makes that happen. It acts as a self-perpetuating trap, continuously thrusting the one person back into the commodity market as the seller of his labor power while continuously transforming his product into the other person's means of purchasing. The worker, in fact, belongs to capital before he even sells himself to the capitalist. But when he sells himself again and again at regular intervals, changing wage masters as the market prices of his labor fluctuate, this at once mediates and conceals his economic bondage. Viewed as the process of reproduction or as an integrated whole, the capitalist production process doesn't simply produce commodities and surplus value. It also produces and reproduces the capital relation with the capitalist on one side and the wage laborer on the other. And so there are endnotes. That's the end of chapter 21. The rich who consume the products of other labor can only obtain them through exchange, so they are continually liable to exhaust their funds. In the social order, wealth is acquired, the property of reproducing itself through the work of others. Wealth, like work and through work, gives a annual fruit that can be destroyed annually without the rich becoming poorer. This fruit is the revenue that arises from capital. This is Sismondi's work on the new principles of political economy of Endnote 2. Wages as well as profits are to be considered, each of them, as really a portion of the finished product. The share of the commodity which belongs to the laborer has been all received in the shape of wages. Mill, 1823, and James Mill's Elements of Political Economy of 1821. Endnote 3, when capital is employed in advancing the workman his wages, it adds nothing to the funds for the maintenance of labor. Casanova, in a note of in his edition of Malthus's Definitions in Political Economy of 1853. Number 4, the wages of labor advanced by capitalists in the case of less than 1/4 of the laborers of the earth. Richard Jones, Hereford, 1852. Number 5, that which is productively consumed is always capital. This is a property of productive consumption which deserves to be particularly remarked. Mill again. Marx noting, or the editor's note is that James Mill was never able to locate this, quote, particularly remarked property, unquote. And note 6, it is true indeed that the first introducing a manufacturer employs many poor, but they cease not to be so, and the continuance of it makes many. The farmer now absurdly asserts that he keeps the poor. They are indeed kept in misery. And note 7, Rossi wouldn't have declaimed on this point so emphatically if they actually solved the mystery of productive consumption. Number 8, the workers of South America's mines have the daily task, possibly the most difficult in the world, of carrying on their shoulders a load of metal weighing from 180 to 200 pounds, which they have to haul up to the surface from a depth of 450 feet. Their diet consists only of bread and beans. If it were up to them, they would eat only bread, but their masters, who have discovered that the men can't work so hard on bread alone, treat them like horses, forcing them to eat beans too. Compared to bread, beans are much richer in bone ash. It's from Liebig, which is also interesting as well. Number 10, if the price of labor should rise so high that notwithstanding the increase in capital, no more could be employed, I should say that such increase of capital would still be unproductively consumed. Number 11, the most productive consumption, properly so called, is the consumption or destruction of wealth. He means consuming the means of production by capitalists with a view to reproduction. The workman is a productive consumer to the person who employs him and to the state, but not, strictly speaking, to himself. Number 12, the only thing which could be said to be stored up or previously prepared is the skill of the laborer. The accumulation and storing up of skilled labor. The most important operation is performed as far as the great mass of labor is concerned without any circulating capital whatever. Hodgkin. That letter might be looked upon as the manifesto of the manufacturers from the cotton famine. The House of Commons, 1863. 14. Readers will recall that when it comes to reducing wages under normal circumstances, the same capital sings a very different tune. With one voice, the masters declare, see the note on master spinners in part 4, the factory operatives should keep in wholesome remembrance the fact that theirs is really a low species of skilled labor and that there's none which is more easily acquired of its quality, more amply remunerated, but of or which by a short training of the least expert can be more quickly as well as more abundantly acquired. The master's machinery, which we now hear he does well to replace annually with improved models, really plays a more important part in the business of production than the labor and skill of the operative, which 6 months' education can teach and a common laborer can earn. 16. Parliament didn't appropriate a single farthing for emigration. Rather, it passed laws that enabled municipalities to keep workers suspended between life and death or to exploit them without paying normal wages. In contrast, when the cattle plague began 3 years later, Parliament couldn't jettison its own customs fast enough and appropriated millions to protect millionaire landlords against any economic damage, even though the landlord's farmers didn't actually suffer damage thanks to the increase in the price of meat. When the Parliament of 1866 opened, the landed proprietors emitted a bestial cry, which showed that one doesn't have to practice Hinduism to worship the cow Sabala, and one doesn't have to be a Jupiter to transform oneself into an ox. 17. The worker demanded sustenance to live. The boss demanded work to make a profit. Sismondi. 18. We will recall that when it comes to child labor, the formality of selling oneself vanishes. 19. There is a clumsy form of this bondage in the county of Durham. This is one of the few counties where the conditions are such that the farmer doesn't have undisputed proprietary rights of the agricultural wage laborers. Because of the mining industry, the latter have some choice. So, unlike what is the rule elsewhere, here the farmer only rents farms with workers' cottages whose rent makes up part of the wage. These cottages are called Heinz houses, and they are rented out to workers in the context of certain feudal obligations using a contract that is called bondage, and that binds the worker to leave someone to fill his place, say a daughter, when he is employed elsewhere. The worker himself is called a bondsman. This relationship shows from a completely new side that the worker's individual consumption is also his consumption for capital or productive consumption. It is curious to observe that the very dung of the hind and bondsman is the prerequisite of the calculating lord. The lord will allow no privy but his own to exist in the neighborhood and will rather give a bit of manure here and there for a garden than bait any part of his seigneurial right. And 20, thus capital presupposes wage labor. Wage labor presupposes capital. They reciprocally condition the existence of each other. They reciprocally bring forth each other. Does a worker in a cotton factory produce merely cotton textiles? No, he produces capital. He produces value, which serve afresh to command his labor and by means of it to create new values. Now, these are, and this I will conclude with this one paragraph here. So hang in there, folks. I think we have already reached the time. The point of this whole business here, chapters 21, 20, and 21 of Capital, Volume 1, the 2024 edition of Karl Marx's Capital. Uh, it's a new translation, and in editor's note 4, or that is lowercase Roman numeral 4, uh, I, the editors have given us a dad joke. Um, the source text that Marx translates for the body of capital refers to Potter as Mr. Edmund Potter and then as Mr. Potter. In his German edition, Marx does something a little different with this name, initially writing it as Herr E. Potter. And people say that Marx couldn't see into the future. Anyway, so much for that. Thank you for listening. It is time for other matters, and I will stop the share and